Have you ever noticed how a piece of ancient text, something written thousands of years ago, can suddenly pop up and feel like it's talking directly about today's news? It's a wild process where old symbols get supercharged with new, powerful meanings. We're going to trace the journey of one of those ideas right now.
So how does that actually happen? How does a cryptic prophecy from the Book of Daniel transform into a playbook for understanding 21st century politics, the media, and even what our kids are taught in school? That's the mystery we're unpacking today. It's a story all about the power of interpretation. All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the original debate, then see how medieval minds put a new spin on it. From there, we'll connect it to modern politics, look at where its voice is found today, and wrap up with what the source suggests is a guide to resistance.
Okay, let's wind the clock way back. Our story kicks off more than 2,500 years ago in the 6th century BC, with a really ambiguous and hotly debated figure from the Book of Daniel.
So this figure is known as the Little Horn. In the original text, it's described as this arrogant, oppressive power that just sort of rises up. But here's the key. Its real identity is totally open to interpretation. And that ambiguity, that's exactly what has allowed it to be redefined again and again and again throughout history. And that ambiguity leads to two totally different ways of looking at this thing. For centuries, the traditional Christian view saw the horn as a literal single person, the Antichrist, who would show up at the end of days. But modern scholars, they often see it more symbolically, as a metaphor for any kind of oppressive power or system of injustice, whether that's a government or even a social structure. All right, now let's jump forward in time. We're heading to the 12th century, which was a really pivotal moment when a few theologians started to radically reshape this ancient prophecy to make sense of their own chaotic times. Now, what's so cool about this is you can actually see the intellectual chain reaction. It all starts with the monk Joachim of Fiore. He argued that the little horn wasn't some evil figure in the distant future. No, it was a symbol for the corruption happening inside the church, right then and there. His ideas then got picked up by others, and, pretty famously, ended up woven into one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written.
And this right here is the crucial point. When Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, he didn't just give a little nod to Joachim's ideas. He fully adopted them. He made them his own vision. And that move basically cemented this new interpretation, the horn as a symbol of corrupt, worldly power deep into the DNA of Western culture. It was no longer just a future threat.
So Dante locks this idea into the culture. But how on earth do we get from a 14th century poem to the political battles of the 21st century? Well, the next step in this journey involves a pretty creative move, merging two completely separate biblical books to create a whole new way of seeing things. Here's the logic, according to the source material we're looking at. Step 1, you take the little horn from Daniel, and you merge it with another famous figure, the beast from the sea in the book of Revelation. Step 2, you interpret that beast's 7 heads not as ancient cities, but as modern nations. And finally, step 3, you sort those nations into 2 camps based on their political values.
And this slide lays out what that looks like. On one side, you have nations seen as holding on to conservative values, things like tradition, national identity, religious faith. These are framed as resisting this symbolic beast. The examples given are the V4 countries in Central Europe. Then on the other side, you have nations that are associated with more liberal values, like internationalism and secularism. In this view, they are seen as embodying the beast's influence. And the examples cited here are the Franco-German axis, which is a major engine of the European Union.
Now, this framework doesn't just stop at countries on a map. It also tries to identify the channels, the specific ways the system allegedly spreads its influence, and 2 of the biggest are the media and our education systems. According to the source, the single most powerful channel is the mainstream media. Now, this is a pretty provocative claim, but the argument presented is that these big media institutions, even though they claim to be objective, actually push a narrative that reinforces the power of a secular, globalist system.
And within this framework, social media is often set up as the main tool for the resistance. It's seen as this decentralized space where counter-narratives can get around the traditional gatekeepers, and it allows voices that might have been marginalized to challenge that dominant story.
This interpretation goes way beyond just the news. The source argues that this same voice can be seen shaping our cultural institutions, everything from the history being taught in schools to the way government agencies operate. You can see some of the specific examples cited right here on the slide.
So, if you're living in this world of competing narratives with all these powerful forces trying to shape what you think, what do?
Well, the source material we're examining concludes with a practical guide for how any individual can navigate it all. It's basically a toolkit for intellectual self-defense. It stresses things like diversifying where you get your information and fact-checking everything. It talks about building personal resilience by knowing your own values and having strong social connections. It also advises you to protect your own autonomy by limiting how much divisive content you consume and taking control of your social media feeds. And finally, to keep your perspective by focusing on positive local action.
Ultimately, when you boil it all down, the core takeaway from this perspective is a call for intellectual independence. It suggests that in this crazy age of information overload and narrative warfare, the most powerful tool any of us have is our own ability to think critically and live by our own well-thought-out values.
And that really leaves us with one last big question. As these ancient ideas keep getting new life in our modern world, and all these different stories compete for our attention, who, at the end of the day, is the final interpreter of the world for you?